right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here are doing a preview and prediction for the 2023 Miami Hurricanes. Looking at this coaching staff, Mario Cristobal enters his second year in Coral Gables after a 5-7 debut season. He was 35-12 in 4 years with the Oregon Ducks. Shannon Dawson arrives after the past 4 seasons with Houston as the offensive play caller. Lance Guidry spent the past 2 years at Marshall calling their plays on what was an elite defense for that football team. The Hurricanes, biggest headline, I think Cristobal's philosophy appears ready to take over the ACC. Looking at this offense, Nick, it was an incredibly disappointing season last year for this football team. Shannon Dawson, he's expected to arrive and implement a more explosive offense that also has great balance and more freedom for the quarterback. And I think that's certainly something that might benefit Tyler Van Dyke. This guy was expected to be a great player in his sophomore season. He had, 25 touchdowns his debut year as a freshman, really lit the world on fire. Very disappointing this past season, but he has showcased nice touch, zip, and accuracy to attack all levels of the field. Some good tight window throws, nice pocket awareness despite limited athletic ability. He regressed this past season, Nick, and he needs to boost his mental processing. He is an old-school pocket passer thrower. He's not going to give you much from a mobility standpoint. 6'4", 224. Freshman year was all great for Van Dyke. This past season, it wasn't very good for him or the rest of this offense. It was 97th in points per game.
Very interesting how Miami has kind of transitioned their entire offensive staff. They brought in a new offensive coordinator. It did not work out this past season. Quickly move on and bring in a new coordinator here. I think Van Dyke is a fantastic quarterback. I think there's a lot of potential with him. Very talented quarterback. You know, the numbers just last year were disappointing, right? 1,800 yards passing, 10 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. The completion percentage I thought was pretty solid at 63.2 for a pocket pass. I think that's a solid number, getting right in that kind of sweet spot that I like. So I think he has good control over the ball. He has good awareness in the pocket. I think the 5 interceptions is not as bad as a number as one might expect. With Van Dyke, I think he's got to find a way to distribute the ball to the players on his roster. The talent at wide receiver isn't quite fantastic, so he's going to have to make some plays on his own and be able to hit those guys in stride. I think there is some potential with Van Dyke. I think the wide receivers are not terrible, but I don't think they're any world beaters here. We'll get to them in a second. But overall, I think Van Dyke should have a better season. I think he certainly is one of the better quarterbacks in ACC. Was he a little too hyped last year? Potentially, but I think he is a really talented quarterback that could have another offseason to find his footing and get comfortable.
This offense returns 5 starters from a year ago. They lose their leading pass catcher in Will Mallory. They do return yards leaders 2 through 10 in terms of pass catching, so that's certainly good to get that experience back. They need a better downfield passing attack. Like you said, only 4 passing plays of 40-plus yards last year. There's 117th in FBS. And one negative here is, Houston used Clayton Tune a lot in the run game. They're not going to have that option with Tyler Van Dyke, so I certainly want to see how they kind of offset his limitations. This run game, Nick, 128 yards per contest. That was 95th in college football. If you know Mario Cristobal, this is a guy that preaches physicality, strong running game, physical offensive line. The entire philosophy is centered around a wall up front, and we'll get to them in a minute. Very excited for the O-line this team has. But they didn't run the ball at all last year, Nick, very well. Henry Parrish, a slashing runner with great initial burst. He arrived from Ole Miss a season ago. Very light on his feet. Allows him to make some smooth cuts. Impressive speed for 5'10", 190. They lost Jalen Knighton, but they added A.J. Allen and then a high-end 4-star Mark Fletcher, a big physical imposer. Great combo of instincts and size. What are the expectations for this running game? And I guess you can elaborate that a little bit more when we talk about the offensive line. But for this backfield, I think this is a pretty good, solid starting point. But if you know Cristobal, they're not going to be 95th in rushing yards per game for very long.
Certainly that number will improve under a Mario Cristobal offense. I think Henry Parrish Jr. is a solid back. 616 yards on the ground is impressive. It's the average per carry, I think, that concerns me. 4.7 yards per carry and only 4 scores on the ground this past season. So that's a number I really need to see increase from him. I think the speed is fantastic. I think he is a good back. I think it does rely on this offensive line, which is a very solid offensive line to kind of counteract and balance. They have to rely on this running game a little bit more this year because the wide receiving core, it has some depth, but I think there's a lot of inexperience here, and they need to be able to find ways to pick up some nice ground game early on in the game.
Looking at this receiving core, like you said, it's not loaded with talent, but I think some of this experience and some of these guys are pretty solid. Colby Young, he's added some size that's going to go with his explosiveness on the outside. Jacoby George, he's expected to make some plays downfield and in the quick passing game with some good yards after catch abilities. Xavier Restrepo, a good slot option, excels at finding some open space. Miami needed to add some speed on the outside, and guess what? They added Tyler Harrell from Alabama. He was expected to do that for the Crimson Tide, never saw the field. He still has 4.2, 4.3 speed, elite quickness from him. They're definitely going to get him on the field this year. I'm not sure what the story was last year with the Tide, but I think this is a guy that they certainly brought in to try and fill that void right there. Cam McCormick, a veteran tight end, who will be an assist on, inline blocking. Elijah Arajo, more balance tied in with his athleticism. I think this is a solid receiving core for Van Dyke to work with. A couple of pieces you can mix and match here. Overall, nothing that's going to blow you out of the water. But I think, again, 2 through 10 in terms of yards last year come back. I think that experience is going to be valuable here.
I think there is some talent here. I think Tyler Harrell is a great piece to add. I was really hoping he would be that breakout star at Alabama. I thought the speed was quite fantastic. I mean, the speed is unbelievable. I thought he would be a great piece. At Alabama, he struggled with injuries, didn't really grasp the playbook apparently. Now he heads to Miami, gets another fresh start back in the ACC. I think he's a solid piece to have there. I think there is some solid pieces here. I think Young is not a bad wide receiver. He had 367 yards last year, 11.5 yards per catch and 5 scores. Restrepo as well. He had a decent season as well. He had limited touches, but he had 240 yards, plus 11 yards per catch, plus 2 scores for him. So not a bad number at all. I think there is some players here, but the experience is not great, and the depth really is lacking.
11.2 yards per catch for this football team last year. That's just not very good one bit. Look at this offensive line. This is a team that lost 8 players in the transfer portal on this side of the ball. 4 of those went to SMU. They joined Rhett Lashley. Added 6. 3 of them on the offensive line. Matthew Lee, a guard from UCF, was one of them. Good functionally strength, good IQ. He understands leverage, smooth movements. Not exactly a mauler, but was a good run blocker, an elite pass blocker for the Knights this past year. 6'4", 295. I think you're going to certainly see that physicality get improved a good bit. This is a big, powerful, athletic group. I think Lee should slot in at center. I also picked up transfer Javion Cohen from Alabama. He took some big strides as a pass blocker this past season at left guard. Jalen Rivers and Ez Cooper, they're going to battle for that right guard spot. But most importantly, Zion Nelson comes back. He's maintained some good athleticism and explosiveness for this added weight. He's about 316 last year, 6'5". Great length. Has shown some good displacement in the running game. Only played 2 games last season, so he's kind of looking for a redemption year. Needs to develop some better power in hands, but he has the physical tools to keep growing. Great piece for Mario Cristobal and this crew to work with. Francis Muga, 6th ranked prospect in the class of 23, a true freshman who fires out of his stance. Great base and leverage and pass pro, some elite movement and quickness, 6'6", 330. They also picked up 20th ranked prospect Samson Okunloa. Great adds and revampments for this offensive line, Nick. I'm very excited for it. When I talked about at the opening, the philosophy of Mario Cristobal is getting involved now to kind of take over this conference. I think it's going to start this year, and it started this offseason with some massive additions for him and Alex Marable to work with on this offensive line.
Ooh, I'll go at right tackle. It's a fantastic piece. True freshman. I think he slots in there perfectly. Such a big physical player. I mean, the size is fantastic. It's 6'6", 330. This guy's an absolute beast at right tackle. I think he fits in perfectly. Javion Cohen, definitely made a lot of improvements at Alabama this past season before transferring. He slots in at left guard. I think he's a good, underrated player. Solid at Bama. I think Matt Lee is a great fit at center. I think he slots in there perfectly. Zion Nelson, I think he's a very underrated left tackle. Good hands. I like the movement on him. And he's Cooper as well. Solid right guard. I think all 5 of these guys are very solid. I think this offensive line group is a really solid group that has a lot of potential to be involved early on and get some great revamp here. This is a very talented group. They hit the portal. They attacked like they needed to and brought in pieces they could use.
I'm going to give this unit a B. I definitely think that downfield passing game and the efficiency on the ground, they got to get better. And obviously your offense is not going to be very good if you can't do any of those things. Shannon Dawson, I think, is going to be a little bit more creative this year. And just knowing the philosophy of what Cristobal wants to attack with, the running game is certainly get better. No way it doesn't. B for me, Nick. I think the potential can certainly bump them up to an A, especially if this offensive line just comes out fire and starts dominating this conference. In Van Dyke, again, this is a guy that has 35 touchdowns over the past 2 years. Most of that came his freshman year. So if you can kind of find that stride once more, this offense has a lot of potential to, maybe be at that 30-point per game mark, maybe even 35 if they can really start clicking.
There certainly is a lot of potential to this offense. I think they have a great quarterback. I think they have a good running back and a really talented offensive line that's been revamped. I worry about the pass catchers, but if those guys can find their stride and be able to get those plays cooking early on, I think this offense could be quite fantastic. I think they could hit 30 points per game, certainly.
Looking at the defensive side of the ball, Miami's really struggled on this part of their football team the last couple of years. 2018, 19. Whenever the turnover chain was installed, that's when they started to really look different, like the old school Canes on defense, and that faded very fast. Manny Diaz could not really keep them in check on that side of the ball. 27 points per game allowed. I thought they were really good against the run, though. But for the most part, this is not a good defense, Nick. You've seen it early on in the year when they lost to Middle Tennessee in front of a home crowd. Well, I think when Middle Tennessee put up 40, 50 points that day, where their secondary was getting absolutely flamed. They do return 7 starters. Their top 3 tacklers returned 4 of the top 5 sack getters. They had 37 sacks last year, the 19th in FBS. And I love this D-line led by West Virginia transfer Akeem Mesidor. He played here a season ago for the Canes and was just phenomenal. Plays with some great leverage, impressive spin move, violent hands. allow him to disengage. An explosive burst. He was a great run defender. 6'3", 280. Leonard Taylor showcases some good power and strength on the inside. He disrupts and collapses the pocket very well. Love his motor. Needs improved hands and some diagnosing, but for a young player, should not be a problem. Jafari Harvey finally produced a bit with some good hands and nice bend. Najee Kelly showed some nice flashes as a true freshman, a great first step, stacks and sheds well. Should continue to help in containing the run. Also picked up Branson Dean from Purdue at 6'2", 280. Was largely a good run defender for the Boilermakers. And then a highly graded nose and Thomas Gore from Georgia State. I think this is just a team that has great depth on the interior. Not so much at edge, but they do have producers nonetheless. And the starters at edge, I think, are going to be valuable for them too. Depth will be tested, but overall, I love this interior, Nick, all around. I think this is just A+ defensive line.
This is a very good defensive line. Mesidor, fantastic last year. 38 total tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, 7 sacks for him. Harvey, 31 total tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks for him. The numbers are certainly there. I think these players have shown some solid talent. Kelly is a true freshman. He had 4.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks and 11 tackles total. So he showed a lot of nice ability early on. They hit the portal. They added Dean and Gore. I think there's 2 solid adds. Overall, I think this is a good defensive line. I like this interior defensive line a lot. I think there's a lot of potential here. These guys get after the quarterback, and they certainly get a lot of sacks.
Mesidor and Taylor had 10.5 tackles for loss each. And then Corey Flagg had that same figure at linebacker. He's expected to be a key contributor for them. 3rd in tackles a season ago. They need to keep adding depth, but this is a quality group. I think at linebacker, Francis Miolaga was a good player all around for Washington State. True freshman Bobby Washington has some great physical potential. Wesley Vicente was a quality player in limited action. This linebacking core, it was a concern coming into last year, and I think it still is one. So it was not a productive group. Caleb Johnson, they picked him up from UCLA. He was 4th on the team in tackles. He's gone now. Didn't really showcase, great impact for them anyways. So this linebacking core is certainly a bit of a concern, but I'm not that worried considering who's playing in front of them. I think it's really going to help free these guys up. But in terms of depth and overall talent, it's definitely not the greatest, Nick.
I agree. The depth is certainly a little bit concerning. Corey Flagg's a fantastic piece to return. 56 total tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks for him. I like those numbers. Good leader there in the middle. I think there is some talent in this linebacking core. It's a little underrated in my opinion, but I think these guys, there is some depth problems. I think Corey Flagg, though, is a good leader, and they hit the transfer portal and brought in some good pieces.
Now you look at this secondary, they allowed 408 yards to Middle Tennessee and only 16 completions. I mean, that's just absurd. 16 yards per attempt for them that day. They gave up 309 next week to Drake May in North Carolina. That was it. They didn't allow over 260 yards through the air the remainder of the season. So they certainly progressed and got better down the stretch. They still got blown out in a lot of games, Nick. 42-point loss to Florida State, 30 to Clemson. They gave up against Pittsburgh, it seemed, final game of the year. But the secondary, I thought, certainly improved in strides, and it's going to all start with the best safety duo in college football, James Williams. Unique size that allows him to be highly effective in the box. A physical tackler, has some good closing burst. He was great in coverage in the middle of the field. 6'5", 224. I don't know how you have a guy playing safety at that size. Cameron Kitchens was a great playmaker. 90 coverage grade along with 6 interceptions. Showcased great eyes. Excellent at tracking the ball. Some good athleticism to get across the field. Good at undercutting routes of a second year to step in front of the ball. Film junkie. This guy has great IQ. 5'11", 202. This is a phenomenal safety duo, Nick. The expectations for them are going to be high this year because they really have to uplift this group.
I agree. I love the size difference. It's incredible when you have 2 guys that have played such different styles and have different sizes. I mean, Williams 6'5", 224, Kitchens 5'11", 202. I think that's a perfect size balance because you get the best of both there. I think both these guys are hard-hitting safeties that are able to get after the ball. They led the team in tackles this past season. They went 1-2. With Kitchens leading the way with 59, Williams just behind him with 58. Kitchens had 6 interceptions, a fantastic number. Each have 6 pass breakups. I think these 2 together are fantastic. I love the way that Williams is just a hard hitter, absolutely lays down the boom. I think the safety duo is fantastic.
Now, the rest of the secondary is where things become a little iffy. This is a thin cornerback group. They added some solid transfers, though. Devontae Brown was a leader in good coverage. Yes, at UCF, Jaden Davis comes over from Oklahoma. He was a pretty sound tackler, but inconsistent in coverage. Jedias Richard was a breakout player for Vanderbilt. I know it was, a big topic when he entered the portal late in the cycle. Terry Roberts, he came over from Iowa. He recently re-entered the portal a couple weeks ago, so does not look like he'll be attending Miami this year. Darryl Porter, a transfer from West Virginia a season ago. Expect better play from him. Top corner from a season ago in Tyreek Stevenson. He was also a transfer, so there's not a lot of moving pieces in this back end for them. Redshirt senior Corey Krause will anchor the slot. His experience is certainly going to be key. As of a few months ago, Markeith Williams was the only other scholarship safety on roster, and they also have 3-star true freshman Caleb Spencer who should be on one, I believe, at this moment in time. So in terms of depth at safety, Nick, not existing at all, really. So that duo is elite, but if things come a little hairy there, that could also be an issue, which would be awful for this defense considering the already concerns they have at cornerback.
Certainly the depth is an issue. I think cornerback is a thin group. I think Brown's not a bad piece picked up from UCF. I think Davis as well from Oklahoma. He has some potential, just inconsistent coverage, like you said, definitely concerning. Richard, not a bad piece from Vanderbilt as well. I think, they hit the portal and try to bring in some guys, but it's going to be a question mark whether these guys can kind of get cohesive and work together and be one unit once it comes to get playing time.
I'm going to give this unit a B+. I love the D-line. The middle of the defense is certainly not great, but Corey Flagg's production last year, I think, is something that certainly you got to keep an eye on. And they have an A+ safety duo there, too. So I think some of those factors combined, Nick, maybe it's really upholding this. It's a big factor here in this grade. So B+ for me. Is that a little bit too high? Or do you think that just because they have those spots figured out that the rest of the defense should be ignored?
I think closer to B was probably what I would say. I think those spots figured out is fantastic, but I do think that the secondary concerns in terms of depth in the cornerback room certainly is something that worries me. I think a B is definitely a more appropriate grade for this defense.
Now looking at the schedule preview and prediction, this is a team that had a great offseason for the offensive line. I expect the power run game to start and take shape, while Van Dyke should find similar rhythm to that of his freshman season. The passing attack brings back plenty of experience. Production needs to take a big leap, as does Van Dyke's mental processing. Vertical speed, even with the addition of Harrell, certainly iffy though. And that might not be great for the Sophomores. I think Shannon Dawson's certainly going to have some type of impact. The defense is loaded up front. Middle of the defense is questionable, but is destined to improve a tad bit. While, a high upside secondary will ultimately dictate the defense's success. If they regress in the back end, that could lead to 4 or 5 losses. I'm a believer in Cristobal, though. I'm a fan of the hires on his staff, and of course, the talent is very underrated. This is going to be a tough out on Saturdays, Nick. I think they're just elite in the trenches. 10-2 for me. I have them beating Clemson, the Clemson offensive line. It's not that good, Nick. They're going to have issues against this Hurricane front on October 21st. Home game for them. I think the offensive line will be able to manage the Tigers' front seven pretty well, and I think potentially in a low-scoring contest, they'll upset the Tigers that day. Not a tough schedule at all, Nick. I mean, look at the first 6 at North Carolina. It's probably going to be the toughest. They host Texas A&M as well, so that's probably definitely going to be the hardest game over the first half of the year. But A&M, they have some issues in their own right. They also had a very disappointing season, and hosting them, I think, is going to pay dividends for this football team. I do have them losing 2 November games back-to-back at NC State and at Florida State. Even though this schedule is a really good draw, that's a bad draw right there, Nick. Those back-to-back road games against the Wolfpack and the Seminoles. Only 2 blemishes on this schedule for me, 10-2. Is this too far? Because Miami certainly kind of like Texas, they continue to disappoint all the time. But again, this schedule is not hard at all, Nick.
I was torn about what I wanted to do with the schedule. I thought about 8-4. I thought about 9-3. I ended up settling on 10-2 like you, except I flipped some of the games I think they will beat. I think they will lose to Clemson at home. I will say Clemson, certainly has the opportunity to win this game. It is a very interesting game. I think it's a coin flip right now. Last time Clemson did play in that stadium in Miami, they didn't play Miami, but they did lose in that stadium, and the Orange Bowl got embarrassed in that game. I think at NC State, I think they'll do better than a lot of people expect them to. I think they can potentially lose at Carolina and Chapel Hill. I think that's a tough matchup, underrated matchup. Drake May certainly had his way with this defense last year, put up a ton of yards. So I think it's possible that Drake May finds another way to torch them again this year. So I think, anywhere from 8-4 to 10-2, I think is where it is. I think 8-4 is certainly what you should expect out of this Miami team. I don't think they'll be any worse than that at this point. I think the schedule is just far too easy, and there's just far too much talent on the front portion of the defense as well in the offensive line and the trenches for this team to have anything less than 8 wins. I think it's a very talented roster top to bottom. I think there are some question marks in the secondary and wide receivers, but I think the overall strength of the trenches and the quarterback play kind of outbalance those concerns for me. I think 8-4 is absolutely the minimum, but I think 10-2 is certainly a very realistic goal for this Miami Hurricanes team.
The over is 7.5 plus money on that selection. I definitely think that's great news for you to say that 8-4 would be the worst case scenario. But it's possible this team just completely disappoints and they lose games to Louisville, maybe even at Boston College. I would hope not. And I think Cristobal is certainly going to get things going in the right direction. I was very happy with what he did at Oregon, and it was only going to continue to get better if this job did not become available. So I think Cristobal is not going to settle for a poor run game. I think they're just phenomenal in the trenches at this moment in time. So I'm very excited for Miami this year. But things, that stigma is still there, Nick, and it's going to be hard to get rid of. So final thoughts on this football team. It's going to be a very exciting year for Miami.
Yeah, certainly I have to shake that expectation, that shake the media pressure, kind of like you get with Texas and other historic programs. I think college football is better when Miami's back. I certainly think when you have programs like Miami, Southern California, Texas all playing well, I think it's better for the sport. I think, Southern California's hit that level at this point. I think Miami and Texas are still getting there. I think Miami could be the first to get there, but over Texas, I think their future is a little brighter in the short term. I think Texas long term is more stable than Miami is right now. I think they're in a good spot. The draw is fantastic. Not a lot of tough road games here. I mean, your toughest road game at Florida State, and then outside of that, at North Carolina State, I think they could win that one. At UNC, I think they can win that one as well. So this is a good year, I think, for the Hurricanes. I like them in the trenches. Cristobal is starting to build a program from within. He brought in new coordinators this year, built a whole new staff around him, and I think that's a really good way to go.
We'll find out week 2 just what this team is made of. That's going to be it for today's episode, Nick. I appreciate you joining me.
Absolutely.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.